So people that I think are struggling to forgive are the French. So it's weird, Dr. Rod, that they have a national day of protest. It's called May Day, and it's the May Day of protest, right? That they regularly, that every year they get out and they peacefully protest whatever it is that they're upset about at the time. Now, unfortunately, right now there's been, I would call them riotous protests that have been happening since mid-January, right? And now we're almost middle of May. So what we're talking like four months this has been going on for. And it all started out because they the French are responding to their loss of retirement. They're moving the age from 62 to 64. And so this is what they're protesting. They're protesting the fact that they're moving the age and they're losing 2 years of their retirement. But they're actually not really protesting that. Yeah, they are. They're upset that they have to work another 2 years or anything. So, I know you see this and you go, if you think about all the time, like an extra 2 years, whatever, like, and in Australia, it's 65 anyway. Like it's like, oh, 62, you're already like 3 years ahead of us anyway. But what they're really protesting about is really their loss of freedom, or sorry, their loss of diplomacy. That's probably the right word for it, their loss of diplomacy. Because President Macron, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I have to say it that way. Otherwise, every time I read it, Dr. Rod, for some reason, I say macaroon in my head.
You wouldn't be the first. And some have done it deliberately.
Yeah, President Macron, without the majority in the parliament, actually deployed a mechanism called Article 49.3, which means he can actually bypass the parliament and go straight to let me get these levels of right. Did I write it down? No. So the Senate or whatever the higher people to be able to vote on it where he knows that he has a majority. Now, this Article 49.3 is a thing where the leader or the president is allowed to bypass parliament for something that is like high importance, and if they feel like this is truly, it has to just be rushed through and go past the being held back in the parliament. So there's a constitutional council deciding whether he's actually allowed to do that. But that's what the protests are really about, is like the fact that he's just kind of just taking control and just gone, well, I'm just going to do what I want. Now, sometimes we as leaders have to make tough decisions. Sometimes we just have to make decisions without asking people's opinions, because we know what's right, we know what's best, and there's sometimes we just have to make those hard decisions. And it seems like from what he's talking about is that, like, his argument is that if this doesn't get passed, because there's an increase in life expectancy, people are living for longer, our retirement fund is going to go bankrupt because we won't be able to sustain paying for people for so long. So we're just increasing it by 2 years to make sure that we can actually still afford and not the country doesn't collapse. Obviously, as an economist, you can share that a little bit more, but actually, yeah, let's do that. Dr. Rod, let's talk practically about that situation first, and then we'll get into the leadership stuff. What's your take on, like, the seriousness of the situation and how much does it really affect the economy and like that sort of stuff?
Well, it will certainly affect some people in the economy. France, along with a lot of other European countries, has very generous social security provisions overall. And certainly people in the United States, where I am at the moment, they would envy what happens in most of the European countries in terms of social welfare of one kind or another. And I think one of the issues that has led to the riotous behaviour of people in France is that the status quo is being interrupted. And you're quite right to say that in Australia and other countries, that age limit on receiving a government pension has been increased. So in Australia, for me, given my year of birth, I have to be 66 and a half years old before I become eligible to any pension payment. For my wife, who's a little younger than I am, she'll have to be 67. And that's when they will stop increasing the age when it reaches that age of 67. So it will be fully 5 years longer to wait than for the French prior to the introduction of this change. But you see, you've actually got to look at any change in the whole context of the country and comparing their age of entitlement to a government pension with ours in Australia, or with what is standard in New Zealand or the United Kingdom or other countries, really doesn't tell the whole story. You've really got to look at the overall situation of government benefits to people. Of course, from the president's point of view, the big issue is actually paying for the pension amounts.
So is that actually, like from an economist point of view, is that such a serious thing that he has to now risk that the whole country's been in turmoil and has pretty much been shut down, since middle of January? Is that such a risk to the future of the country's economy?
Well, it may be in the long term. At the moment, France devotes something like 14% of their gross domestic product, if you like. That's the size of the national economic pizza, from which we all derive our living standard and so on. They spend about 14% of that on pensions, which is actually quite high by international standards. And of course, what's happening, not only is the population aging, but the proportion of people who are actually paying taxes is falling.
These people having less children.
The size of the working, that's right, the size of the working age population is falling away as well.
And everyone's becoming influencers.
There's a
no one's actually doing real work anymore.
For the budget and for the economy as people get older and they reach for their entitlements, but there are fewer and fewer people as a proportion of the population who are actually making enough income to pay taxes. So there is also that whole issue of intergenerational equity going on here.
Yeah.
But the French have tended to be a bit more likely to protest than the citizens in many other countries. And demonstrations by farmers, for example, have been quite regular occurrences in France for many decades now. Look, once a government gives people something, people are extremely reluctant to give it up. So I'm not all that surprised that there have been as many protests as have been recorded in terms of the changes to pension. And sometimes saying, well, look over there in a different country, they've got a different age, doesn't really satisfy people, because their reaction is really based on the experience that they've had in their own country. And frankly, they couldn't care less what happens somewhere else. Yep. I do think, however, that we just need to be really careful that we don't end up making an idol of the government pension. I hear so many Christians who can't wait to get on the pension. I think, what is wrong with you? I mean, I want to stay off the pension as long as I can.
Yeah,
I want to be able to work to earn a decent salary. Yep. I'd rather never to rely on the government. I just don't understand why it is that Christians seem to think it's a good idea to rely on governments.
And I don't want to stop working either. I love what I do. I
would say it's nice that it's there, though. It's good that it's there. But look, as Christians, our whole mindset should be on work, doing productive work that's meaningful work, that's just helping somebody else thrive,
Yep.
it's not necessarily paid employment. As you know, much of the work I do nowadays doesn't produce any income at all. I sit on boards. People are not paying me for that. I chair a board. I'm not paid for that. I've been asked to join more boards, as a matter of fact. None of them are offering payment. It's wonderful that I can work and not receive a salary.
Yeah.
But we should all remain active. We will live a longer life, and I dare say it'll be a much happier life. So look, these things are quite complex. Every nation really has faced this issue of an aging population on average, which means there's a smaller proportion of the population carrying on the tax burden, so to speak. It is offset to some extent, of course, by the fact that some people actually do work much later than they otherwise might. And I would add, a lot of people enjoy it because work is more, as it were, than just the work. It's about social relationships and place in society and so on as well. And all of those things can be very important to people in terms of their own self-image.
Yeah. So I kind of feel like there's two different stories here for leaders, right? And to go on the kind of the theme of today about how we deal with loss, how leaders deal with loss, obviously it's the protesters that are dealing with loss of their retirement that are going out and protesting. Now, I have like in my brief research and looking around, they did say that obviously there's all these violent, clashes between, the police and protesters and setting things on fire and breaking into places and all that sort of stuff. Like there is that happening. However, a lot of the reports that I said it's only really on the fringes, and the majority of the protest is actually peaceful. So that's reassuring because all you're seeing from it is like France is rioting and it's tearing itself apart, right? They're obviously not dealing with the loss well because they're rioting. However, this actually kind of goes back to our first thing, that my first bit of a rant that I spoke about is like, how do we know how's the best way to challenge authority, right? That most of us are maybe in a leadership position, but most of us are actually under someone else. And if not, we're under a government, we're under the police, and so how do we, let's take out the fact that maybe he's doing this right, or he can do this, or the president, or whatever. Like, let's take that out of it. But people feel like their powers, their democratic powers, that's kind of like the main thing. Let's even leave the retirement thing aside. They believe that the president's kind of just, kind of abusing his power, so to speak, right? And they want to fight against that, stand up against that. Like how do we righteously fight for our rights? What's the difference between a protest and a riot? Obviously, I know violence and all that, but like, how do we reconcile that?
Well, look, firstly, as Christians, we should recognise that our sustenance comes from God, not the government.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the wonderful blessings that we have of being Christians is that we can rely on God to supply all that we have need of. Sometimes, of course, we've got to work our faith muscle. It's not easy come.
Yeah,
but,
look, I agree with that. And let me just, you hate to use the word, but let me play devil's advocate for a moment, because I know lots of people that there is one side of the camp that they do that. They're like, put our complete faith in God, and then they ignore what's happening, and then politics, they don't vote right, they don't, like, do you know what I mean? Like there's, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a world of like, well, this is not what I wanted. It's like, well, did you do anything about it? Or did you just go, God's my provider, right? Like, how, What's your response to those people?
Well, don't be silly.
Yeah.
Dear, God's my provider, but look around for opportunities. Ask God to show you doors that you might be able to go through in terms of generating some income. Sometimes, by the way, you've accumulated an awful lot of stuff, and you can sell that and make a lot of money. When I say a lot of money, quite a few $1,000s. So every now and then we should take stock of what we have to see whether there's some that we're not really using anymore. And if you're a bit short of cash, sell it. Now, you can't do that forever, of course. That's only something which you can do in the short term. But look, always before you rush into protest, just check yourself and say, look, do I really believe that God is my provider? Second, when what we are dealing with is something you don't agree with that's happened through political decision making, don't forget that you've always got the ballot box, at least in democracies we have.
Yeah.
That isn't the case everywhere, but we shouldn't use our democratic rights without great care and judgment. So, I talk to a lot of Christians who disconnect spirituality from the ballot box, yet we really must include the spiritual side of things in our decision about for whom we vote. I think that's absolutely critical. So for my own part, without sort of naming any parties, there are some political parties who have rules that bind their parliamentarians and so on, which would make it extremely hard for me to vote for them because I'm philosophically opposed to that approach, fundamentally because in a true democracy, your local representative should be looking after locals and paying attention to local issues. But I guess we're getting off the topic a little bit here. Is there a role for say peaceful demonstrations publicly? Yes, there is. There's no doubt about that. And in a country like Australia, there are rallies, protests in most of the major areas of population against certain moral occurrences or certain government legislation or government practices that go against the moral thinking of Christians. I think that's part of what we're meant to do as Christians, actually. We're meant to be in the public square, and we are meant to make our beliefs, our values, our position on key policy areas. We're meant to make them public. I think we are meant to have a presence in the public square. So yes, there is a place for protesting, and I think it should always be a peaceful protest. Are there any circumstances under which things might go so far that we should take up arms against government? Well, I believe that to be true. I don't believe that to be true in the case of the French president about whom we've been speaking, because I don't think the issue at hand is of the kind of nature that would warrant a significant uprising by the population.
So you don't feel like going on to the other leadership lesson we're talking about with this is sometimes leaders just have to make the hard decisions and bypass the normal channels of communication to just maybe the country might be going bankrupt if this doesn't happen, and it's just one of, and he's probably doing a bunch of other things as well, but this is what they're jumping on. How do we as leaders make sure we approach that decision? Because obviously communication is important, keeping everyone following the right channels of process and everything like that is really good, because if you do away with that, the whole system falls apart. Like I agree with that. However, how do we as leaders make these tough decisions that sometimes we just know that something has to be done and avoid an uprising like this?
Well, that's a difficult one, because when you're talking about an uprising, it's not something which is really led by one person. My understanding is that these particular protests and riots were certainly originally, they were quite organic. They just happened. A bit like the fires of revival that are being reported right around the world at the moment. They just happen. And in one case, they're a sovereign move of God. In another case, I guess you could say they're a sovereign move of man.
Yeah.
I don't think they're all that edifying, but as leaders, we should encourage people to hear from God, and we should do the same ourselves. Now, most people in leadership positions are probably not going to be engaged a lot in public protests. I don't know what it's like in many other countries,
but let's take it from this point of view. We all know the story. You're a pastor of a church. Just imagine you're a pastor of a church, and you need to make a decision to move location, move service time, do something, appoint a new leader, remove a leader from a position, whatever. And you know that this is just, it needs to bypass the normal modes of putting it out to the church for a vote. And like this, it just is one of those things that just needs to happen. And that there's always unfortunately a select group of people in the church that are ready to pounce and protest against anything and rally everyone and create a bit of a revolt and maybe try to create a faction in the church. We've all seen it, right? How do we as a leader make that tough decision, knowing that there's the volatility of something like that happening?
Look, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're talking about whether or not as a leader I should participate in what we might call a church split.
No, what I'm saying is making the actual decision that the president did of bypassing the normal approval processes and everything like that, is making that decision that is just a tough decision that that just needs to be made.
Well, the first thing you've got to make sure is that you've got the constitutional power to do that. And my understanding is Macron did that. But a church leader always has to be bound by the rules, the norms that are bound up, say, in the constitutional documents of the organisation. So, in some denominations, there's quite strict law. We call that canon law, actually, which will dictate the sort of processes involved. And I think you need to follow those. The case we were looking at, in the case of President Macron, there was a power he could invoke. Now, it was contestable, that power, which I understand it has been contested by a constitutional court, and the constitutional court has found certainly that in a technical sense he had the authority to bypass the normal channels. So you need to make sure that that's actually something which your founding documents allow before you do it. Otherwise, I don't think you've got much option but either to grin and bear it or to resign. I think it's very dangerous to overrule a constitutional document.
So that's good. So obviously make sure we've got the rights to do it. Like that's great. Make sure we're following policy. Good. You and I both know that a lot of people don't care about policy and they care more about their feelings. And so how do we avoid those people? How do you approach that? You have to make this decision. You've checked your constitution. You have the policies are in, right? You're above board with everything, but there's going to be a revolt about it. How do we approach that situation?
Well, you've really got to determine in your heart whether it's the right decision to make. And if you say, well, okay, I realise that there will be protests, there will be those who criticise me, there are those who might try to pull me down, remove me. If it's the right decision, you need to make the right decision using the right process and the right channels. I have been in that kind of situation before, and it was uncomfortable. A group of people came and said they thought I should remove myself. I said no, because I'd heard from the Lord that it wasn't time to make the change. But interestingly, a few months down the track, I heard unmistakably from the Lord that it was time to step down from that leadership position, and I let people know. And by that time, they were in fact really sorry to see me go. Something I guess had changed. They had a different perception, perhaps. So you've got to really look into the specific context. I think
Yeah.
what's led up to the situation. What are the potential ways forward? And is it essential that happen under a new leader? I guess if the answer to that is yes, then if you're that leader, you really need to go before somebody shoves you. But it's not that easy to draw all these lessons from the Macron example, because it sits within the context of a particular national constitutional framework, and it appears that he's got the constitutional power to do what he did.
Yeah.
So I don't see much of a problem with it. And of course, his background is in business, and he's looking ahead into the future and drawing the conclusion that we're going to have a lot of trouble funding other things if we tie so much of our annual income as a nation, if we tie so much of that up in paying pensions into the future, bearing in mind that it will grow. So I don't know whether, as leaders in other contexts, we're necessarily in exactly the same sort of situation. Probably the most common thing that might happen would be that if you happen to be, say, a director, you need to become a bit more engaged in management activities. You and I have actually talked about this in recent times ourselves, that sometimes just for a season it's necessary for those in a governance position to take on more of a management role, but that should only be for a season as well, and that might produce a bit of protest. But I think we just got to look at the particular context. I'm thinking about some correspondence I received just this week about a protest march that was held in Brisbane against abortion. And those protests are generally extremely well organised. Everybody's pleasant, everyone's courteous, and they're planned. All the permissions have been received from the police and so on and so forth. So they're meticulously planned, and that I would see as Christians exercising their right effectively to have a say in the public square. So I think that kind of thing is fairly regular, and it's a good thing, actually. It's part of our participation as citizens of a free country, of a democratic country. But it's much more difficult when we start talking about specific situations within a particular organisation. It's a little bit different when the people who are protesting, the people on our own payroll.
Yes.
The power dynamics are different, and so on.
Yeah. So if you feel like you're losing your powers or your rights or whatever, or your democratic freedom, and feel like you need to protest, make sure you protest peacefully, right? Follow the right channels, follow the right communication, like sit down with people, have a chat, like gather people, like try to do it with wisdom and not get emotional over it. I think that's probably the real separation between, there's people that you can be passionate about something without getting emotional, because when emotions come in, that's where things tend to break down. So make sure, if you feel like you're called to protest something, do it with wisdom, do it with peace. Taking that calm, like Dr. Rod said, there's peaceful process that happen, and it's fine. Do follow due process, and yes, fight for your rights, but just remember, when we're fighting for our rights, we are still representing the King. And so we want to still bring kingdom through the way that we protest as well. And then also, if you feel like you have to make that tough decision as a leader, sometimes we do have to bypass majority votes and things like that. Just make sure that you're following your protocols, make sure you are within your governance requirements to do so, and make sure that you are right in what you do. That right word, right comes from righteous. You're being right in what you're doing. Make sure that is done well. Hey, that was an excerpt from our On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, put a comment below. And if you want to see more content like this, faith-based leadership development content, make sure you check out our channel, give it a subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you'll be notified when we release new content.